Hey friends, when we left off reading holes last, they were all the guys were in kind of a therapy group, and Mr. Pendanski asked Zero what he'd like to do, and he said, "I like to dig holes." So let's see what happens next. All too soon, Stanley was back out on the lake, sticking his shovel into the dirt. X-Ray was right. The third hole was the hardest. So was the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth, and he dug his shovel into the dirt. After a while, he'd lost track of the day of the week, or how many holes he dug. It all seemed like one big hole, and it would take a year and a half to dig it. He guessed he'd lost at least 5 pounds. He figured that in a year and a half, he'd either be in great physical condition or dead. He dug his shovel into the dirt. It couldn't always be this hot, he thought. Surely it got cooler in December. Maybe then they froze. He stuck his shovel into the dirt. His skin had gotten tougher. It didn't hurt so much to hold the shovel. And as he drank from his canteen, he looked up at the sky. A cloud had appeared earlier in the day. It was the first cloud he could remember seeing since coming to Camp Green Lake. He and the other boys had been watching it all day, hoping it would move in front of the sun. Occasionally it got close, but it was just teasing them. His hole was waist deep. He dug his shovel into the dirt. As he dumped it out, he thought he saw something glisten as it fell into the dirt pile. Whatever it was quickly buried. Stanley stared at the pile a moment, unsure if he'd even seen it. Even if it was something, what good would it do him? He'd promised to give anything he found to X-Ray. It didn't seem worth the effort to climb out of his hole and go check it out. He glanced up at the cloud, which was close enough to the sun that he had to squint to see it. He dug his shovel back into the earth, scooped up some dirt, and lifted it over his dirt pile. But instead of dumping it there, he tossed it off to the side. His curiosity had gotten the better of him. He climbed up out of the hole and shifted his fingers through the pile. He felt something hard and metallic. He pulled it out. It was a gold tube about as long as wide and as wide as the second finger on his right hand. The tube was open at one end and closed at the other. He used a few drops of his precious water to clean it. There seemed to be some kind of design on the flat closed end. He poured a few more drops of water on it and rubbed it on the side of his pants pocket. He looked again at the design graved into the flat bottom of the tube. He could see an outline of a heart with the letters KB etched inside it. Here's a picture of it. He tried to figure out some way he wouldn't have to give it to X-Ray. He could have just kept it, but that wouldn't do him any good. He wanted the day off. He looked at the large pile of dirt near where X-Ray was digging. X-Ray was probably almost finished for the day. Getting the rest of the day off would hardly do him much good. X-Ray would first have to show the tube to Mr. Sir or Mr. Pendanski. He'd then have to show it to the warden. By then, X-Ray might be done anyway. Stanley wondered about trying to secretly take the tube directly to the warden. He could explain the situation to the warden, and the warden might make up an excuse for giving him the day off so X-Ray wouldn't suspect. He looked across the lake toward the cabin under the 2 oak trees. The place scared him. He'd been at Camp Green Lake almost 2 weeks, and he still hadn't seen the warden. And that was just as well. If he could go his entire year and a half without seeing the warden, he would be fine with that. Besides, he didn't know if the warden would find the tube interesting. He looked at it again. It looked familiar. He thought he'd seen something like it somewhere before, but he couldn't quite place it. "Hey, what do you got there, caveman?" asked Zigzag. Stanley's large hands closed around the tube. Nothing, just, It was useless. "Well, I think I might have found something." "Another fossil?" "No, I'm not sure what it is." "Let me see," said Zigzag. Instead of showing it to Zigzag, Stanley brought it to X-Ray. Zigzag followed. X-Ray looked at the tube, then rubbed his dirty glasses on his dirty shirt and looked at the tube again. One by one, the other boys dropped their shovels and came to look. "It looks like an old shotgun shell," said Squid. "Yeah, that's probably what it is," said Stanley. He decided not to mention the engraved design. Maybe nobody would notice it. He doubted X-Ray could see it. "No, it's too long and thin to be a shotgun shell," said Magnet. "It's probably just a piece of junk," said Stanley. "Well, I'm going to show it to Mom," said X-Ray. "See what he thinks. Who knows? Maybe I'll get the day off." "Your hole's almost finished," said Stanley. "Yeah, so?" Stanley raised and lowered his shoulder. So why don't you wait until tomorrow to show it to Mom," he suggested. "You could pretend you found it first thing in the morning. Then you get the whole day off instead of just an hour or so in the afternoon." X-Ray smiled. "Hey, good thinking, caveman." He dropped the tube into his large pocket on the right leg of his dirty orange pants. Stanley returned to his hole. When the water truck came, Stanley started to take his place at the end of the line, but X-Ray told him to get behind Magnet in front of Zero. Stanley was moving up in the line. It's a bummer Stanley didn't get to keep it. That night, as Stanley lay on his scratchy and smelly cot, he tried to figure out how he could have done things differently, but there was nothing else he could do. For once in his unlucky life, he was in the right place at the right time, and it still didn't help him. "You got it?" he asked X-Ray the next morning at breakfast. X-Ray looked at him with half-opened eyes behind his dirty glasses. "I don't know what you're talking about," he grumbled. "You know," said Stanley. "No, I don't know," snapped X-Ray. "So just leave me alone, okay? I don't want to talk to you." Stanley didn't say another word. Mr. Sir marched the boys out to the lake, chewing some sunflower seeds along the way and spitting out the shells. He scraped the ground with his boot heel to mark where each boy was supposed to dig. Stanley stamped down the back of the blade of the shovel, piercing the dirt hard. He couldn't figure out why X-Ray snapped at him. If he wasn't going to produce the tube, why did he make Stanley give it to him? Was he just going to keep it? The tube was golden color, but Stanley didn't think it was real gold. The water truck came a little after sunrise, and Stanley finished the last drop of water and stepped out of his hole. At this time of day, Stanley sometimes could see distant hills or mountains on the other side of the lake. They were only visible for a short while and would soon disappear behind the haze of heat and dirt. The truck stopped and the dust cloud drifted past it. X-Ray took his place at the front of the line. Mr. Pendanski filled his canteen. "Thanks, Mom," X-Ray said. He didn't mention the tube. Mr. Pendanski filled all the canteens and climbed back into the cab of the pickup. He still had to bring water to Group E. Stanley could see them digging about 200 yards away. "Hey, Mr. Pendanski!" X-Ray shouted from his hole. "Wait, Mr. Pendanski! I think I might have found something." The boys all followed Mr. Pendanski as he walked over to X-Ray's hole. Stanley could see the gold tube sticking out of some dirt at the end of X-Ray's shovel. Mr. Pendanski examined it and took a long look at its flat bottom. I think the warden is going to like this." "Does X-Ray get the day off?" asked Squid. "Just keep digging until someone says otherwise," Mr. Pendanski said. Then he smiled. "But if I were you, Rex, I wouldn't dig too hard." Stanley watched the cloud of dust move along the lake to the cabin behind the trees. The boys in Group E were just going to have to wait. It didn't take long for the pickup to return. Mr. Pendanski stepped out of the cab. A tall woman with red hair stepped out of the passenger side. She looked even taller than she was, and Stanley was down in a hole. She wore a black cowboy hat and black cowboy boots, which were studded with turquoise stones. The sleeves on her shirt were rolled up, and her arms were covered with freckles, just like her face. She walked right up to X-Ray. "This is where you found it?" "Yes, ma'am." "Your good work will be rewarded." She turned to Mr. Pendanski. "Drive X-Ray back to camp. Let him take a double shower and give him some clean clothes. But first, I want you to fill everyone's canteen." "I just filled him a little while ago," said Mr. Pendanski. The warden stared at him hard. "Excuse me?" she said. "I just filled them when Rex—" "Excuse me," said the warden again. "Did I ask you when you last filled them?" "No, but it's just—" "Excuse me." Mr. Pendanski stopped talking. The warden wriggled her finger at him for him to come to her. "It's hot, and it's only going to get hotter," she said. "Now these fine boys have been working hard. Don't you think it might be possible that they might have taken a drink since you last filled their canteens?" Mr. Pendanski said nothing. The warden turned to Stanley. "Caveman, will you come here, please?" Stanley was surprised she knew his name. He had never even seen her before. Until she stepped out of the truck, he didn't even know the warden was a woman. He nervously went toward her. "Mr. Pendanski and I have been having a discussion. Have you taken a drink since Mr. Pendanski last filled your canteen?" Stanley didn't want to cause any trouble for Mr. Pendanski. Well, I still got plenty left," he said. "Excuse me?" He stopped. "Yeah, I drank some." "Thank you. May I see your canteen, please?" Stanley handed it to her. Her fingernails were painted dark red. She gently shook the canteen, letting the water swish inside the plastic container. "Do you hear the empty spaces?" she asked. "Yes," said Mr. Pendanski. "Then fill it," she said. "And the next time I tell you to do something, I expect you to do it without questioning my authority. Is it too much trouble for you to fill a canteen? I'll give you a shovel then. You can dig a hole and the caveman can fill your canteen." She turned back to Stanley. "I don't think that's too much trouble for you, would it? I don't think that'd be too much trouble for you, would it?" No," said Stanley. "So what will it be?" she asked Mr. Pendanski. "Do you want to fill the canteens, or do you want to dig?" "I'll fill the canteens," said Mr. Pendanski. "Thank you." Mr. Pendanski filled the canteens, and the warden got a pitchfork out of the back of the pickup. She poked it through X-Ray's dirt pile to see if anything else might have been buried in there as well. "After you drop off X-Ray, I want you to bring back 3 wheelbarrows," she said. X-Ray got to the pickup. As he pulled away, he leaned out the window and waved. "That's a bummer. It should be Stanley getting the day off." "Zero," said the warden, "I want you to take over X-Ray's hole." She seemed to know that Zero was the fastest digger. "Armpit and Squid, you'll keep digging here where you have been, but you're each going to have a helper. Zigzag, you help Armpit. Magnet, you help Squid. And Caveman, you'll work with Zero. We're going to dig the dirt twice. Zero will dig it out of the hole, and Caveman will carefully shovel it into a wheelbarrow. Zigzag, you'll do the same for Armpit, and the same with Magnet and Squid. We don't want to miss anything. If either of you find anything, you'll both get the rest of the day off and a double shower. When the wheelbarrows are full, you're to dump them away from this area. We don't want to mix the dirt piles up." The warden remained at the site for the remainder of the day, along with Mr. Pendanski and Mr. Sir, who showed up after a while. Occasionally, Mr. Sir would leave to take water to the other groups of campers, but otherwise he and the water truck stayed parked there. The warden saw to it that nobody in Group D was ever thirsty. Stanley did as he was told. He carefully looked through the dirt dug up by Zero, and he shoveled it back into the wheelbarrow, though he knew he wouldn't find anything. It was easier than digging his own hole. When the wheelbarrow was full, he took it to a good distance away before dumping it. The warden couldn't keep still. She kept walking around, looking over the boy's shoulders and sticking her pitchfork through the dirt piles. "You're doing fine, just fine," she told Stanley. After a while, she told the boys to switch places so that Stanley, Zigzag, and Magnet dug in the holes, and Zero, Armpit, and Squid shoveled the excavated dirt into the wheelbarrows. After lunch, Zero took over digging again, and Stanley returned to the wheelbarrow. "There's no hurry," the warden said several times. "The main thing is not to miss anything." The boys dug until each hole was well over 6 feet deep and wide. Still, it was easier for 2 boys to dig a 6-foot hole than for 1 boy to dig a 5-foot hole. "All right, that's enough for today," the warden said. "I've waited this long, I can wait another day." Mr. Sir drove her back to her cabin. "I wonder how she knew all our names," Stanley said as he walked around the compound. "She watches us all the time," said Zigzag. "She's got hidden microphones and cameras all over the place, in the tents, the rec rooms, the shower." "The shower?" asked Stanley. He wondered if Zigzag was just being paranoid. "The cameras are tiny," said Armpit, "no higher than the toenail on your tiny toe." Stanley had his doubts about that. He didn't think they could make cameras that small. Microphones, maybe. He realized that was why X-Ray didn't want him to talk about the gold tube at breakfast. X-Ray was afraid the warden might have been listening. One thing was certain. They weren't just digging to build character. They were definitely looking for something. And whenever they were looking in the wrong place. Stanley gazed out across the lake toward the spot where he'd been digging yesterday when he found the gold tube. He dug the hole into his memory. As Stanley entered the rec room, he could hear X-Ray's voice from all across the room. "See what I'm saying?" X-Ray said. "Am I right or am I right?" The other bodies in the room were a little more than bags of flesh and bones dumped across broken chairs and couches. X-Ray was full of life, laughing and waving his arms around as he talked. "Yo, Caveman, my man," he called out. Stanley made his way across the room. "Hey, slide over, Squid," said X-Ray. "Make room for the Caveman." Stanley crashed onto the couch. He had looked for a hidden camera in the shower. He hadn't seen anything, and he hoped the warden hadn't either. "What's the matter?" asked X-Ray. "You guys tired of something?" He laughed. "Hey, keep it down, will you?" groaned Zigzag. "I'm trying to watch TV." Stanley glanced uncertainly at Zigzag as he was staring very intently at the busted television screen. The warden greeted the boys at breakfast the next morning and went with them to the holes. 4 dug in the holes and 3 tended to the wheelbarrows. "Glad you're here, X-Ray," she said to him. "We need your sharp eyes." Stanley spent more time pushing the wheelbarrow than digging because he was such a slow digger. He carted away the excess dirt and dumped it into the previously dug holes. He was careful not to dump any of it into the hole where the gold tube was actually found. He could still see the tube in his mind. It seemed so familiar, but he just couldn't seem to place it. He thought that it might have been the lid to a fancy gold pen. KB could have been the initials of a famous author. The only famous authors he could think of were Charles Dickens, William Shakespeare, and Mark Twain. Besides, it didn't really look like the top of a pen. By lunchtime, the warden was beginning to lose her patience. She made them eat quickly so they could get back to work. "If you can't get them to work any faster," she told Mr. Sir, "then you're going to have to climb down there and dig with them." After that, everyone worked faster, especially when Mr. Sir was watching. Stanley practically ran when he pushed his wheelbarrow. Mr. Sir reminded them that they were not Girl Scouts. They didn't quit digging until every other group had finished. Later, as Stanley sat sprawled across an understuffed chair, he tried to think of a way to tell the warden where the tube was really found without getting himself or X-ray into trouble. It didn't seem possible. He even thought about sneaking out at night and digging in that hole by himself, but the last thing he wanted to do after digging all day was to dig at night, too. Besides, the shovels were locked up at night, presumably so they couldn't be used as weapons. Mr. Pendanski entered the rec room. "Stanley?" he called as he made his way to him. "His name's Caveman," said X-ray. "Stanley?" said Mr. Pendanski. My name's Caveman," said Stanley. "Well, I have a letter here for someone named Stanley Yelnats," said Mr. Pendanski. He turned over an envelope in his hands. "It doesn't say Caveman anywhere." Thanks," Stanley said, taking it. It was from his mother. "Who's it from?" Squid asked. "Your mother?" Stanley put it in a big pocket of his pants. "Aren't you going to read it to us?" asked Armpit. "Give him some space," said X-ray. "If Caveman doesn't want to read it to us, he doesn't have to. It's probably from his girlfriend." Stanley smiled. He read the letter after the other boys had gone to dinner. "Dear Stanley, it was wonderful to hear from you. Your letter made me feel like one of the other moms who can afford to send their kids to summer camp. I know it's not the same, but I'm very proud of you trying to make the best of a bad situation. Who knows, maybe something good will come of this. Your father thinks he's real close to a breakthrough on his sneaker project. I hope so. The landlord's threatening to evict us because of the odor. I feel sorry for that little old lady who lived in a shoe. It must have smelled real awful. Love from both of us." "What's so funny?" Zero asked. It startled him. He thought Zero had gone to dinner with the others. "Oh, nothing, just something my mom wrote." "What'd she say?" Zero asked. "Nothing." "Oh, sorry," said Zero. "Well, you see, my dad is trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers. So the apartment kind of smells bad because he's always cooking up these old sneakers. So anyway, in the letter, my mom says she felt sorry for the little old lady who lived in a shoe, because it must have smelled really bad in there." Zero stared at him blankly. "You know, the nursery rhyme?" Zero said nothing. "You've heard the nursery rhyme about the little old lady who lived in a shoe?" "No." Stanley was amazed. "How does it go?" asked Zero. "Didn't you ever watch Sesame Street?" Stanley asked. Zero stared blankly. Stanley headed on to dinner. He would have felt pretty silly reciting nursery rhymes at Camp Green Lake. For the next week and a half, the boys continued to dig in and around the area where X-ray had supposedly found the gold tube. They widened X-ray's hole as well as all the other holes that Armpit and Squid had been digging until the fourth day, when all three holes met and formed one big hole. As the days wore on, the warden became less and less patient. She arrived later in the morning and left earlier in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the boys continued to dig later and later. "This is no bigger than it was when I left yesterday," she said after arriving one late morning, well after sunrise. "What have you been doing down there?" "Nothing," said Squid. It was a wrong thing to say. At just that moment, Armpit was returning from a bathroom break. "Well, how nice of you to join us," she said. "And what have you been doing?" I had to, go." The warden jabbed at Armpit with her pitchfork, knocking him backward into the big hole. The pitchfork left 3 holes in the front of his shirt and 3 tiny spots of blood. "You're giving these boys too much water," the warden told Mr. Pendanski. They continued to dig until late afternoon, long after all the other groups had finished for the day. Stanley was down in the big hole along with the other 6 boys. They had stopped using the wheelbarrows. He dug his shovel into the side of the hole. He scooped up some dirt and was raising it up to the surface when Zigzag's shovel caught him in the side of the head. He collapsed. He wasn't sure if he passed out or not. He looked up to see Zigzag's wild head staring down at him. "I ain't digging that dirt up," Zigzag said. "That's your dirt." "Hey, Mom!" Magnet called. "Caveman's been hurt." Stanley brought his fingers up to the side of his neck. He felt his wet blood and a pretty big gash just below his ear. Magnet helped Stanley to his feet, then up and out of the hole. Mr. Sir made a bandage out of a piece of his sack of sunflower seeds and taped it to Stanley's wound. Then he told him to get back to work. "It isn't nap time." When Stanley returned to the hole, Zigzag was waiting for him. "That's your dirt," Zigzag said. "You have to dig it up. It's covering up my dirt." Stanley felt a little dizzy. He could see a small pile of dirt. It took him a moment to realize that it was the dirt which had been on his shovel when he was hit. He scooped it up. Then Zigzag dug his shovel into the ground underneath where Stanley's dirt had been. I'm going to read one more chapter because I'm enjoying myself. The next morning, Mr. Sir marched the boys to another section of the lake, and each dug his own hole, 5 feet deep and 5 feet wide. Stanley was glad to be away from the big hole. At least now he knew how much he had to dig for the day, and there was a relief not to have other shovels swinging past him or the warden hanging around. He dug his shovel into the dirt, then slowly turned to dump it into a pile. He had to make his turn smooth and slow. If he jerked too quickly, he felt a throbbing pain just above his neck where Zigzag's shovel had hit him. That part of his head between his neck and ear was considerably swollen. There were no mirrors in the camp but he could imagine that he looked like a big hard-boiled egg sticking out of him. The remainder of his body hardly hurt at all. His muscles had strengthened, his hands were tough and calloused. He was still the slowest digger, but not all that much slower than Magnet. Less than 30 minutes after Magnet returned to camp, Stanley spat into his hole. After a shower, he put his dirty clothes into his crate and got out his box of stationery. He stayed in the tent to write a letter so Squid and the other boys wouldn't make fun of him for writing to his mother. "Dear Mom and Dad, camp is hard, but challenging. We've been running obstacle courses and have a swim long distances in the lake. Tomorrow we learn..." He stopped writing as Zero walked into the tent, then returned to his letter. He didn't care what Zero thought. Zero was nobody. "To rock climb. I know that sounds scary, but don't worry." Zero was standing beside him now, watching him write. Stanley turned and felt his neck throb. "I don't like it when you read over my shoulder, okay?" Zero said nothing. "I'll be careful. It's not all fun and games here, but I think I'm getting a lot out of it. It builds character. The other boys..." "I don't know how," said Zero. "What?" "Can you teach me?" Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. "Teach you what, to rock climb?" Zero stared at him with penetrating eyes. "What?" said Stanley. He was hot and tired and sore. "I want to learn to read and write," said Zero. Stanley let out a short laugh. He wasn't laughing at Zero. He was just surprised. All this time he thought Zero was reading over his shoulder. "Sorry," he said. I don't know how to teach." After digging all day, he didn't have the strength to try to teach Zero to read and write. He needed to save his energy for the people who counted. "You don't have to teach me to write," said Zero. "Just to read. I don't have anybody to write to." "Sorry," Stanley said again. His muscles and hands weren't the only parts of his body that had toughened up over the past several weeks. His heart had hardened as well. He finished his letter, and he barely had enough moisture in his mouth to seal and stamp the envelope. It seemed that no matter how much water he drank, he was always thirsty. We'll stop there. So now we have found out that Zero has no family. He's completely alone, and he doesn't know how to read and write. And Stanley actually isn't being very nice. He asked him for help, and doesn't want to help him. And what he actually said was that Zero was a nobody, which is super mean. So stay tuned for next time. Happy reading, friends.